For the month of July, we've been focusing on the environment and on environmentalism. And I don't know if everyone knows this, but our denomination, the United Church of Christ, or the UCC, has been involved in the environmental movement since its earliest days. We've also been heavily involved in anti-racism efforts, and we were a driving force behind establishing a link between racism and environmental pollution. These two concerns, racism and environmentalism, started out as separate efforts, as separate movements, as separate streams, if you will, in general. But then these two streams that were running side by side came together, and that happened within the UCC. And that's the story that I'm going to focus on today. The story of how these two streams came together to become a river or a mission area that is now referred to as environmental racism. When the United Church of Christ was formed in 1959, environmentalism had not really arisen yet as a concern, but racism was a huge concern. And our involvement both in anti-racism and environmentalism was as frontline leaders. We were on the front lines. We were there marching with MLK Jr. And we were there involved in as early as society began to come to grips with the problems caused by pollution. If you were alive back then, you might remember back in the early 60s when Americans were consuming large amounts of gasoline containing lead and inefficient engines were running on all vehicles with really low mileage. Industry in general was releasing massive amounts of smoke, sludge, and chemical byproducts with little concern about bad press or environmental regulations or anything like that. Air pollution was commonly accepted as the smell of prosperity, a sign of progress. It's not something we should discourage, certainly not regulate. That all started to change around the same time as the civil rights movement was gaining steam, when an environmentalist book was released by Rachel Carson called Silent Spring, 1962. The book created a cultural awakening. It sold about 6 million copies and caught the attention of our church. The book raised awareness about the impact of pollution for all living organisms and showed a clear link between pollution and public health. We as a church saw environmentalism as a cause that we could all get behind, finally. During that time, the civil rights movement was dividing the country, left versus right, black versus white, north versus south, as the country grappled with racism, both in policy and practice. And so there was this thought that maybe caring for the environment could be a unifying factor in our divided country. After all, air pollution and water pollution impact everyone, the poor, the young, the old, all races, all animals, all plants, everyone. So that was our initial hope. And later on, we would uncover the strong link between racism and pollution, but I'll get to that soon. So as we approach the 1970s with the Vietnam War, the murder of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., riots, the Cold War, there was plenty of division. Yet there was this optimism that we could find unity as a country under the banner of environmentalism. To some degree we did. In 1970, after much effort and more division than we ever anticipated, the Clean Air Act was passed and a day was set aside to honor the earth known as Earth Day. Pollution standards started to take hold, some more effective than others. We mostly cured the problem of acid rain. You remember acid rain? We did so by instituting a program of cap and trade on sulfur emissions. You remember the ozone hole? It was successfully healed to a large degree by reducing Freon and other similar chemicals that were used in air conditioning and in industrial processes. And the UCC was on the front lines. We were leaders in every one of these efforts. We were organizers in the 1970s, sponsoring events, preaching on the environment. and being a peaceful presence, a prayerful presence at all demonstrations. Although that movement was primarily led by white folks, black folks, Hispanic voices were not fully at the table, which meant despite the early environmental movement's success, there were still some blind spots. At the same time, in the late 1960s, the UCC was actively involved in the civil rights movement, and one of our churches had become a flashpoint due to racism in Wilmington, North Carolina. And soon, North Carolina would become very important to both streams of our story. Both anti-racism and environmentalism would come together, would merge there. The anti-racism leg of this story involved a high school where a number of black students were protesting their treatment during a half-hearted attempt at desegregation by the Wilmington school system. About 8 or so students who led this effort were members at a UCC church. And that church encouraged them and supported their efforts hugely. But they needed more help. They weren't getting anywhere. So their pastor contacted the denomination, contacted UCC leadership. And the UCC sent a young Benjamin Chavis, Jr., from the UCC's Commission for Social Justice to work with this group of black high school students and UCC youth. That's right, the UCC literally employed black activists during the civil rights movement, as we do to this day. Chavis, one of these young activists, he was 24, and he came to Gregory Congregational UCC to provide leadership to these high school students. And he was very successful. Suddenly, this UCC church, a mostly black church, happened to have a white pastor, became the center of anti-racism efforts in the entire area. Ben Chavis, who had worked directly with Martin Luther King Jr., in fact, Ben had trained under Martin Luther King Jr., was unbelievably effective, listening to and prioritizing the students' issues and creating effective countermeasures. And not surprisingly, this enraged the KKK and other white supremacy groups in the area. Soon, that UCC church was under siege. The life of the pastor was repeatedly threatened. Grocery store to the left, a few hundred feet away, was burned to the ground. A black youth was shot to death by a police officer. Behind the chair, a white policeman was shot to death. All within a block of the church. Several hundred Klansmen had arrived in town and were believed to be behind much of the violence. The National Guard moved in and surrounded the UCC church and slowly brought the situation under control. The problems at the high school, which ended up being centered around our UCC church in Wilmington, served as a wake-up call to the local black community. The UCC decided to keep Ben working there to support anti-racism efforts in the wider community. He had been so successful. And Ben began his efforts to be ordained as a pastor in the UCC. Chavis was very effective, continued to be effective, as he led efforts to reduce the impact of systematic racism, and things were looking up. They were looking up for the black community in Wilmington, so it seemed. In reality, behind the scenes, evidence was being fabricated by local police, and 3 witnesses were lined up to testify against Chavis and his inner circle of student activists. In March of 1972, Reverend Chavis and 8 young black men, still in high school or recent graduates, were arrested by police in the doorway of our church in Wilmington. One white woman, a friend of the UCC pastor, was also arrested when she refused to testify against Ben Chavis, and then started to publicly uncover the fabricated charges. So she was jailed, and she was included as an accessory to the fabricated crimes. This group of 10 people would become known as the Wilmington 10. They were all found guilty in a sham trial, and each was sentenced to about 28 years. I think Ben got 35. They were all 10 immediately imprisoned. No one would post bail. So we did that. United Church of Christ stepped forward. We posted bail for the entire group during the appeal process. We paid for lawyers. But we lost the appeal. We couldn't get a court in North Carolina to even hear the case. And we, the UCC, were torn. Many white churches in North Carolina, in the North Carolina area, found it impossible to believe that the police would frame these young men. They must be guilty. Yet our UCC leadership knew with little doubt that these people were innocent and the victims of a racist, white supremacist system designed to discourage any sort of anti-racism activists. The fabrication of charges against black leaders was part of that system. And now that practice had ensnared the UCC. A system that routinely jailed and falsely convicted black men to silence them, get them out of the way. Our denomination, that in 1972 was only 15 years old, was called, made a commitment, publicly invested our name behind these men, our faith, our resources, into the struggle for freedom for our own staff member, the young Ben Chavis, and the 9 others as well. Freedom for these 10 became a rallying point for the UCC on an international cause. The UCC continued to support these activists as much as we could, spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on the effort. We paid for instance, and supported Ben as he attended seminary while incarcerated, a special arrangement we were able to orchestrate. 6 years later, 1978, Amnesty International declared the Wilmington 10 political prisoners. Yet it was not until 1980, after all the witnesses had publicly recanted their stories, that a circuit court in North Carolina finally overturned their convictions and they were released. But not without a cloud over their heads. It wasn't until 2012, 40 years later, that they were officially declared innocent. Soon after Ben Chavis Jr. was released, he was ordained by the UCC and he was employed at a very high level as a leader in the denomination working on efforts to end white supremacy. And it was the newly ordained Ben Chavis who would soon be drawn into, guess what, the environmental justice cause. And this is where the two streams regarding justice, the stream of racial justice and the stream of environmental justice, merge together. At the same place, at the same time, through the same man. And while Ben was in prison, also in North Carolina, we have to back up a little bit, the late 1970s, a group of residents began to protest the creation of a landfill for the disposal of highly toxic PCBs, which were at that point banned by Congress. A private company, the Ward PCB Transformer Company, trying to avoid EPA rules, intentionally dumped about 32,000 gallons of PCB contaminated oil along 240 miles of highway shoulders in 14 counties. They basically loaded up the trucks, drove down the highway, and dumped as they went. Once discovered, the contaminated soil along the highway had to be cleaned up and put somewhere. No one wants toxic waste in their neighborhood, all right? And so the locations get chosen are usually poor areas. Poor areas where people have little or no political power, where land is cheap, easy to come by, in short, where the people impacted are not in a position to fight it. But in this case, it wasn't the poorest county that was selected, it was the county with the most black people. And this is where a little-known hero, another UCC member named Dollie Burwood, comes in. When it was announced that her county was going to be the dump site for those 32,000 cubic tons of PCB contaminated soil, this 32-year-old black woman who was also a UCC church member stood up and said, "No, I don't think so. That's not right." Dollie was the mother of 2 young daughters at the time, but was also a veteran of the civil rights movement herself. So she organized local residents and local churches and civil rights leaders, including the UCC leadership and her UCC church, to march to the dump site to sit in the road as a nonviolent protest. She was arrested, and the next day she thought, who could I get to help with this? So who did she call? Ben. She called Ben Chavis. He'd just gotten out of jail, to spend 8 years in jail. He was ready to go. Chavis was able to confirm with evidence that what Dollie suspected, that the dump site location had been selected based on the race of the residents in that county. Under their leadership, the protests grew, lasted about 6 weeks, and over 500 people were arrested in the process. And that's when the term environmental racism, a term that had never been used before, was coined by Reverend Chavis. When the first 10,000 planned truckloads of PCBs arrived in September of 1982, hundreds of protesters laid down on the highway to prevent the trucks from entering the site. This was the largest civil disobedience in the South since Reverend King had marched through Alabama. And it was the first time in American history that citizens were jailed for trying to stop toxic dumping, for attempting to prevent pollution. And they were successful. The site was ultimately closed. And the national reporting of this story led other people from across the country to contact Reverend Chavis, with many other examples of environmental racism. Under Reverend Chavis' leadership, the UCC's Commission for Racial Justice issued a landmark report in 1987 called Toxic Waste and Race in the United States. The study showed that race was one of the biggest factors associated with the location of toxic waste facilities nationwide. 3 out of 4 Black and Hispanic Americans lived in communities that housed what the EPA called uncontrolled toxic waste sites. As Reverend Chavis said, the issue of environmental racism is an issue of life and death. It's not just an issue of some form of prejudice where someone doesn't like you because of the color of your skin. This is an issue that's going to cost you your life if you do not get involved. Since then, United Church of Christ has continued its environmental justice work. And environmental justice, or creation justice as we often call it, has become a core part of our denomination's character. The UCC's creation justice movement has been involved in uncovering dozens of situations where pollution, where pipelines were located someplace based on the race of the residents, with Blacks and Hispanics exposed to far more pollution than others in America. United Church of Christ is committed to giving voice to the powerless, to upending structures of power that distribute pollution to certain groups while protecting others. Our UCC ministry in the area of environmental justice is due to Dollie Burwood and Reverend Chavis, who championed both anti-racism and protection from environmental hazards, and whose activism continues even today. They're still at work today. They're both in their 70s. They're both with us still. All this pollution, all this garbage we dump in the air and land and water ends up in our bodies, in all life, in our children. As Reverend Chavis put it, it's a matter of life and death. Today, environmental justice ministries have become an important part of our denomination's DNA. In affirming the divine gifts of creation and in affirming our connection to God, each other, and the world around us, we commit ourselves to the intertwined responsibilities of caring for creation and seeking justice for the oppressed. Because God has called us to action, and we've heard that call through Jesus Christ. Amen.